political correspondent, and does that create a vacuum that is filled perhaps by technology, or perhaps, dare I say it, by forms of PR? And how do we, as the public, ensure that we're properly informed and equipped to engage in the political process? So, any questions exploring those avenues or completely different ones? I'm very keen to take. We've got a hand up at the back.
You just mentioned the growth of social media, and I was thinking that this also makes journalism and other types of communication vulnerable to surveillance. We've seen corporate surveillance, criminal corporate surveillance from News International, and also covert state surveillance. And how far do you feel that, with the revelations of Edward Snowden, that this kind of vulnerability to surveillance potentially impacts on confidentiality of sources and the decency, the rigour of the public sphere generally, and journalism's role within that?
Ivor, is that one you want to?
Well, I don't want to answer it because we might be overheard. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a well-made point. I mean, on the one hand, journalists want their words to be heard as widely as possible. So in one sense, we don't mind who broadcasts it. Seriously, I mean, as I used to be an investigative journalist like Helen, and even before the days of electronic communication, trying to maintain as much security as possible, i.e. by doing most of our work face-to-face, was important. So I think journalists now have to be even more aware. I mean, certainly we know that in the various newspaper groups they have some standalone computers in order to try and counteract any hacking of their own work. I think one other observation I'd make before asking colleagues, I think one of the, I mean, what is it? I haven't come here to bury the dictionary, I've come to praise it, but I'll just throw a few more grains of earth under the coffin at this stage, because the failure to rigorously report the whole issue of state surveillance is one of the failures of the lobby. They were very easy. This parliamentary committee, which was set up over the famous Great and the Good, has not had the sort of rigorous analysis that it really should have, because it's had a very close relationship with the security services ever since it was established. And I think it's outsiders. I like Jonathan's definition that journalists should be outsiders. It's the outsiders who have thrown the spotlight on the uselessness of that committee. So I think your points are well made, but they apply to all journalists, not just political journalists.
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to say that I don't know if I'm particularly worried about it. We've all, well, I did a lot of investigative work at the Times, and you were always sort of being watched by the ministers and that sort of thing. And I did a number of FOI requests. And once ministers got wind of it, because obviously these things took months, so they'd know about it beforehand. I wanted to back the Treasury for 2 years to release information about Gordon Brown. And they tried every step of the way to prevent it, even to the point that on the day they released the information, we waited till he'd gone to Afghanistan. They then said they'd bike it across London at rush hour. Oh, and by the way, we're putting it online as soon as you sign for it, so it's not your story anymore. We got around it, but that's the kind of tactics they have. And I've had ministers ringing up saying, we know you're printing this story, we know you put questions into, I don't know, the cabinet or someone, I'm going to speak to your editor and effectively get you sacked. And James Pennell tried to do that to me once when he was pensions minister, about a story I'd actually worked on with another politician, Steve Webb, who's now quite influential in the coalition. And it's not true, it's not true. The editor basically balked at it. Instead of putting it on page 1, put it on page 40. And then a year later, it was on the front page of another paper because it was true. So I'm not particularly worried, I don't think. And particularly when you're a lobby journalist, they're keeping a pretty close eye on you anyway. I mean, the Tories, for example, there was 2 senior press officers, one of whom's Cameron's aide and the other who was head of the press office. And this is about 3 years ago, so maybe it's changed. I seriously doubt it. Every day, they'd come round and they'd do the gamut of the press gallery. And they'd just walk into, I couldn't believe it when I first got there, they'd just walk into each office. And the Times literally had a Portakabin glued onto the edge of Westminster. Everybody else shared offices, but because you were the paper record, you got a Portakabin. And they just come in each day and wander in at deadline and say, so what are you up to, what are you writing about? And they tell them, unless there was an exclusive. And I'd just be sitting there going, is this how this works? So, yeah, I'm not really bothered about surveillance because I'm used to it. And also, if they're watching you, you're probably doing something right.
Something that bothers you and concern about sources?
I think not beyond the norm. I mean, you know, obviously it is something that you're concerned about. Protecting sources. If somebody tells you something, you know, you absolutely have to make sure that that person doesn't become public if they don't want to. But I can't say it's a particular issue that's come across me.
Do you want to come in on that, John?
Well, I just think it's quite early to actually make judgments about to what extent that it's affecting the holding that confidentiality of sources. Is that if people can't be assured that their name's not going to come up in connection with the story, if they can't be sure of that, they're not going to be telling you the story kind of thing. I haven't really seen or anything anecdotal to explain whether that is being filtered through. I know governments don't particularly like the idea of confidentiality of sources kind of thing, so they're never big fans of that. But I think, you know, it's something you have to watch. I agree with either that papers will have to sort of come up with ways of trying to protect journalists, trying to protect information to keep sources absolutely confidential.
Is the questioner want to come back in on that? Or?
Just say thank you.
I was wondering about the other end, say, what if, and we see this in the popularity of, say, internet memes like these cat pictures with some funny text below it. What if the internet sort of, and to some extent one sees it in terms of which sites get most visitors, makes that sort of thing more popular, sort of the joking or the half-truths or the thing that's more spectacular than it is sort of informative. What if the internet leads to more of that, and especially if also there's fewer paid journalists who actually can afford to sort of do the background research and instead mostly relies on sort of reporting things that either come from newspapers which there will be fewer and fewer of, and then combined with sort of things that are more spectacular than true. Like.
You're worried about a dumbing down of public discourse?
Yeah, to some extent, and also if there's nobody there to check the facts anymore to do the background work. Of course, there will still be some niche sites, maybe where somebody as a hobby sort of looks into things very much, but it's very, I mean, there may be a gap that appears in this book.
John, to you're fact checking every day.
Look, I think there's probably little doubt that you can look at it that way. That I mean, for example, one of the only newspaper groups to be sort of making money and hiring more journalists is the Mail, and it's largely accepted that it's that sidebar of what they call the sidebar of shame, you know, all the stuff about reality show stars. That's getting them all the traffic. And BuzzFeed is another organisation which, and again, you know, that's doing it by. I mean, some would say it's doing it by trivialising everyday discourse. Others would say it's bringing people into news stories. You know, I'm not sure. What do people think?
Well, I think it applies across all journalism, actually. It's not a problem that's pertinent to lobby or political journalism. And it's certainly true that if you look in a newsroom today, the age is much younger, the experience levels are much thinner. I think it's a more of a homogenous background in terms of the reporters, because lots of them just can't afford to spend 3 years at university and a year at journalism college, and often it's who you know, which has always been to a degree true of journalism, but it's particularly so now there are fewer jobs. There's certainly less time. When I started as a journalist, I'd go and cover a court case. I'd have all day just to do one story. So at lunchtime I might, chum up with a barrister or talk to the police. Today you'd probably have to do maybe a curtain raiser before you even went there for online. You then have to do another story for online at lunchtime, in the morning proceedings. You might have to update online at about 4:30, and then you might get around to writing the story for the paper. You've not had a chance to talk to any contacts. You've rewritten the same story about 4 times, and the quality of it just basically contracts. So But I'm optimistic, and I think journalists will adapt. I've had to completely reinvent myself as a journalist. I'm now an online journalist, trying to do quality journalism in the cultural arena, as well as a number of other freelance roles I have. And I genuinely believe that there is a desire for quality writing out there. It's just how many people are going to provide it.
I mean, another aspect of this, another way of looking at it is that, I mean, you know, what you describe is clearly true, but has always been the case that there's that, you know, if you want that kind of stuff, you can kind of find it. It might be in a different form, but pretty much it's there. And I think what you could argue is that one of the benefits of political journalism, proper political journalism, is that actually it gives you that extra analysis, proper reporting, which lifts it above the other kind of stuff that you can find.
Yeah, it was very interesting to hear the panel sort of reflect on the changes that have occurred to the lobby, and obviously some criticisms that Helen was making about the culture, I suppose. But I just wondered if anyone wanted to sort of defend that special relationship or the access that the lobby allows in terms of political journalism, or if there is any value that's worth preserving in that sort of very particular and curious sort of lobby setup.
No, I think there is a reason for it. I mean, I think the fact that that you're a political journalist with some expertise. I mean, whatever form of journalist you're in, if you're a specialist journalist, you're always going to want to develop contacts so that you can get the inside track and give your viewers or readers or whatever, better information. And I think being within the lobby gives you the ability to do that within a political sense. Now, I absolutely agree with Helen about the dangers of it and the fact that you've got to be careful how you do that. And I think another danger of it, which is slightly different, but kind of connected to what Helen was saying, is that you can become too chummy, actually, with the politicians, and you can almost see yourself as being on the same side, and perhaps not willing to criticise, or perhaps in the way you should, if you begin to feel that way. But I do think it's wrong. I do think there is a very clear reason for its existence, that you're a political specialist, you need the contacts, and you just have to try to use that in the right way.
Yeah, up to a point. There was a time when you could exploit your contacts, your political knowledge or analysis. But I think since the days of New Labour and the blessed Alistair Campbell, we have a different game in town. Trevor Kavanagh, who was political editor of The Sun for many years, didn't get all those fantastic front-page exclusives by digging and investigating techniques and hard work. He got it because he was working for The Sun, he was working for Rupert Murdoch's paper, and Alistair wanted to reward and keep News International on board for understandable and some might say laudable reasons. He wanted to win the election, he wanted their support. And I think that has profoundly, the impact of New Labour and Campbell's has profoundly corrupted the relationship between media and politicians. I've just finished reading the surprisingly well-written memoirs of Damien McBride, which are very well worth reading. And he gives a very brutal and unvarnished, I mean, the comparison between that and the Campbell Diaries is quite dramatic. Because, in the Campbell Diaries, the general impression was, we did our best to get our best coverage we could, but, sometimes we did something. McBride reveals the very brutal manipulation that took place with him deciding which papers would get what stories. And one saw that from the outside because you weren't getting the stories, and you thought it was due to the brilliance of the reporter who you were battling against, but actually it all came down to ownership, politics, and New Labour.
I agree with most of what you say.
You don't?
No, I do.
Oh.
I do.
You work for News International. I thought you were going to tell me the inside story.
Well, I saw a similar thing happen at the Times with Tom Baldwin, who's now working for, is it Ed Miliband?
Indeed.
He was the deputy political editor, and Campbell was his best mate, to the point that they looked like each other. And Tom, he initially, I didn't know him very well, but I should say here, initially he was really sceptical, I think, of the politicians, and he went through a really paranoid phase where he thought Lord Ashcroft was bumming his wastepaper bin, because there was a very famous spat with Ashcroft in the Times. But later on, he was clearly just being given press releases a day early from Campbell about Brown, and there'd be page leads in the Times. But my general point is that I think that what will happen increasingly is that people will start to trust individual journalists rather than entire organs, for want of a better word. And that's certainly something I do. For example, I think Fraser Nelson, who is a former colleague of mine and is now the editor of The Spectator, I think he's a fantastic political journalist. I wholeheartedly disagree with most of what he says. He's incredibly right-wing. But he's a brilliant writer. He doesn't truck any nonsense from politicians. He's an example of someone who didn't really enjoy being in the lobby physically and actually was quite happy to go back to his Spectator office. But is very well connected. And I would encourage you to read him even if you don't agree with his politics. So I think that's what will happen. We'll get more big names. You'll think, well, actually, I trust them. I don't trust the paper, but I think they're doing a good job.
And in a sense, an outsider in the way that
Yes.
Jonathan described earlier.
And the better journalists were.
I've got so many questions, but the one I'd like to ask is about access and the degree to which the trust in journalism is. Do you think it's still about you've been able to get the information and put it out there? You've got the sources, you've got the relationships, you can find things out which you can then distribute to the readership. In an environment where there's so many other people doing the same thing, there's the Twitter sources and everybody else blogging and away about it. Or is it in the analysis? I mean, is it still the case that political journalists have some kind of privileged access to information, and that's what is going to be the foundation of their ongoing power? Or is it in your ability to gather together, to tell the story?
Journalists aren't even in the lobby. I mean, the commentariat. You know, as Holly told me once, I had Fraser Nelson. Is Fraser still in the lobby? Anyway, he's not off the lobby.
Yes.
The most influential journalists are those outside the lobby who are writing, who have columns, and they pick up the phone. So in that sense, but that's always been the case to some extent.
Can I just throw that to you, Jonathan, because on these issues of trust and new media and analysis and commentary, I think it's sort of core to what you're doing.
I think, well, politicians have got unprecedented access to people. You can dial into any of their Twitter feeds and find out what they think and what they're saying. They're doing it in real time. So I think analysis is absolutely the kind of a mature role of political journalists and all political commentators. I think we are seeing a lot more people who couldn't necessarily consider themselves to be traditional, journalists who've got access to audiences who consider their job to be to interpret and to sort of, I guess, tabulate to an extent what's coming out of Westminster. So I think the idea of sort of privileged access is a lot less important. I mean, as Ivor was saying beforehand, purely the whole technological side of things, when in order to find out what was going on, you actually had to be there. I think that's come that's no longer the case, and the people who are wielding power increasingly are going to be the people who can make sense of that. But also people that have got the trust of a large number of people, the audiences, whether that's Guido Fawkes or Fraser Nelson or the Conservative Home blog or whatever. But so it's, in a sense, it's a changing breed of people.
I mean, to go back, to what you're asking, speaking from my own perspective, I think it's sort of a mixture of those two things, actually. For me, it's slightly different because I'm not covering sort of national politics, so I'm looking for stories which are specifically relevant to the Northwest. And so for me, partly it's about the agenda and what stories you pick up on and which ones you don't. and sometimes you might be the only person who's interested in a certain subject. Sometimes it could be maybe Granada are doing the same story, or somebody, a fantastic journalist like David Bartlett, for example, who's got a blog on the Liverpool Echo. So partly it's about trying to find stories which other people haven't got. Sometimes it's just about finding stories of interest which don't interest other people, but hopefully your audience. And sometimes it is just about delivering it in a different way, or giving it a certain analytical spin.